Hi, I'm Shanker Singham. I am the chairman of Global Vision. We are here interviewing Damian Green, who is the former Deputy Prime Minister and the leader of the One Nation caucus in the Conservative Party. We had first met during the Malthouse Compromise proceedings on the solution to the Irish border, which was a huge problematic issue in the negotiations for the UK to leave the European Union. You worked with Nicky Morgan and with Jacob Rees-Mogg and Steve Baker and Ian Duncan Smith and others in that group, and it was a drawing together of the sort of left and right of the Conservative Party, if you will. Can you talk a little bit about what you wanted to achieve from that experience?
There were two things really. One was the political point that should show that, if you like, in those days, left and right were defined purely in European terms. We have moved on since then, I hope. But then the people who had been Remainers and had been strong Brexiters could work together. And the second point was to try and find a practical solution, to find a way that we could actually sign a withdrawal agreement and yet not have unnecessary border controls either at the border between the Northern Ireland and the Republic, or across the Irish Sea between Northern Ireland and the UK. And it's interesting that for those of us who sat through those fairly tortuous days last year, that it was much derided at the time as a unicorn, it couldn't possibly be done. But actually, that's sort of where we've ended up with the current withdrawal agreement. It's not massively dissimilar to the sort of ideas we were coming up with.
Yes, and in fact, we then had the Alternative Arrangements Commission that Greg Hands and Nicky Morgan both co-led. Nicky obviously is a colleague of yours on the One Nation Conservative caucus as well. And that led to a set of proposals that ultimately the government, I think, ran with in Brussels and led to the solution to the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it shows that sort of working on detailed solutions is worthwhile. And obviously we were all on the backbenches at the time, so it was I hope a constructive input into where we've eventually got to. And any contribution to ending the agony of what was British politics for the past 2 or 3 years is I'm pleased to have been involved.
Yes, and I think it really brought people together, and I think it brought a solution, and there was a body, and it's not over yet because we obviously have the Northern Ireland Protocol now, and there will be negotiations on that, and we need to make the Northern Ireland GB trade channel work effectively. And so that is ongoing work, and I think that will continue during the course of the year. But you talked about finding solutions and being pragmatic and practical, and let's talk about some of those and what you mean by One Nation conservatism, because I think we've heard about HS2 obviously and big infrastructure projects and trains and so on, but it's got to be about more than that. It's got to be about essentially giving the people in northern constituencies that the Conservative Party won from Labour in particular a better quality of life. How are we going to give them lower their food prices, lower their energy costs, lower clothing costs, make real benefit to their quality of life? Is that something that the One Nation Conservative group is looking at? What else are you looking at in terms of how we retain those votes?
Well, it's part of that. It's much more than that, I should say, because I mean, One Nation conservatism, I mean, you strip it back, it was when Disraeli, who never used the phrase, talked about two nations, the rich and the poor, between whom there is no sympathy and contact. And absolutely, this strand is really important, central strand of conservatism has always been about saying we don't want to run that kind of country. We want a country where everyone can feel involved, everyone can feel that they can make the most of their lives. Now, as it happens, there is an intersection between that concept of conservatism, which Boris himself is forever describing himself as a one nation conservatism. He absolutely was a one nation mayor of London when he was doing that job. So I think this is a completely sincere desire of his to run a one nation conservative government. And it does involve, as part of it, allowing people to have practical aspirations, to be able to say, I may have been born here,
right.
but well, two things really. Either I can make it to the top of my profession, and even better, that the place where I come from can itself improve and can share in a rising tide of prosperity. There are clearly other issues. I mean, we are very concerned in the One Nation Caucus about the Union. Clearly, that there is a threat to the UK in its traditional sense, with developments both in Scotland and in Ireland, and we are very much a unionist part of the Conservative Party, but also economically, socially, in policies like health. We want to see practical measures that enable everyone to make the most of themselves and to be able to spread that feeling of prosperity that is quite often associated rightly with London and the southeast of this country to those areas of the country where we've now got Conservative MPs where we've literally never had them before.
And you used a really important word, though, aspiration. Historically, I think people have considered the Conservative Party to be the sort of party of the rich, and not really interested, as you said, in the lives and the conditions of aspiring people. I remember when I was an advisor to Mitt Romney, he used this phrase that the Democrat Party was the party of the rich, and the Republican Party was the party of the people who wanted to be rich. And the idea that it was actually aspiration that the traditionally conservative parties should have been expressing. Talk a little bit about that. What sort of message do you want to send to people all over the country about what they can achieve and who they can be and what kind of country we want to be?
Well, I think the two go together. I completely agree, and interestingly, that Mitt Romney analysis is borne out in the last general election, where in a reversal of what people traditionally think, actually graduates were almost the only group that predominantly voted for Labour, but if you like, the traditional aspirational working class, to use what I think is a rather old-fashioned phrase, voted heavily Conservative. So we need to be able to tell these people and demonstrate this, and there's no point politicians saying things. People need to see in their lives that they have got, or their children have got, a good education, and if good vocational training, if that's what they want to do, or the possibility of going to university in a way they can afford, whatever they need to do what they want in their lives, that is available to them in their locality. But it needs to go wider than that, and there's a danger that the levelling up agenda, which absolutely I'm completely on board with, who could not be, needs to be about more than trains, or even more than trains and buses, because I get the point, some of it has to happen quickly. It has to be about education as well. It has to be about health. There are huge health inequalities in this country. Matt Hancock quite often quotes the point that if you're a man born in Buckingham, you've got a healthy life expectancy of 68. In Blackpool, the equivalent is 53. Now, that's not acceptable. If you're born in Blackpool, you want to think, I've got the same life chances in health and education, as well as seeing your high street improving in many of these smaller towns outside the big cities. So there is an across-the-board government agenda of actually looking at what you need to do. And some of it may well involve changes to the tax system. Some of it does obviously involve public investment. Some involves using educational programs. I think health prevention, I think, is really important. I think the NHS is pretty good at curing illnesses. It's not very good because it doesn't spend much of its budget. It only spends 5% of its budget on preventative measures. If it increased that massively, then actually you would reduce some of those health inequalities, and you would see visible differences in places like Blackpool and other places that have traditionally been disadvantaged.
That's very. Let's change tack a little bit now and talk about the trade agenda of the UK and domestic regulatory issues, because obviously that's the big issue for the next year with our negotiation with the EU and with the US and Australia, New Zealand, Japan. Obviously, there's quite a lot to do. How do you and how does the group interface with those issues, and how do you see the UK's trade policy agenda going forward?
I mean, the big question for the government, in a sense, is one of capacity, because in an ideal world, Britain would be conducting the trade negotiations with the EU in parallel with trade negotiations with the US and Australia and so on. And it seems to me that there's a common sense in saying, where do we do most of our trade? Let's try and do those deals first. So therefore, the European deal is probably more important than any other deal. But I absolutely get the point that if you can, if we have got the capacity to do more than one serious negotiation at once, then we should do so. There are clearly political issues on the American side. I mean, it seems to me, if you're negotiating with the Americans, then the run-up to a presidential election, they will be as tough as they ever will be. So I think practicalities suggest that we might not be signing or even getting close to signing an American deal till after November. So that, I think, reverts to my original point, that therefore, let's crack on with the deal with the EU. But I mean, obviously, in a way, as many of us have always argued, that deal ought to be quite easy because we're starting at the same place. But clearly, the key issue is how much do we want to tie ourselves into a European system that will reduce our negotiating leverage with the rest of the world. And that's the decision that the government is now going to have to take.
Yeah, and clearly we don't want to be a rule taker to Brussels. So therefore the issue is recognition and recognition and equivalence and adequacy, and we need to really win those negotiating points with the EU, but we don't control them. So we don't know how they're going to respond. But it would seem to me that there's a lot of private sector interest in recognition and equivalence and adequacy, and that's where we need to focus our sort of attention.
I completely agree with that, and I think the other key thing for us is to learn the lessons of the travails of the negotiation. One is, which we seem to be doing, is to reject any kind of sequencing that they produce, saying you can't have this until we've agreed that. Well, let's not do that. And the second is to draw as few red lines as possible. Once we've declared something as a red line and raised, therefore, its political salience, if you like, here, then that makes the negotiations more difficult. So I think sort of quiet firmness is probably the stance we should adopt, rather than a sort of megaphone diplomacy of setting out negotiation positions in speeches and so on.
Yeah. In terms of the US side of things, you talked about the election and everything. Obviously, there's some big issues between the UK and the US. One of them was the role of the Chinese telecom company Huawei, where the US feels very strongly. You've said some things about Huawei, which I think are important. I think my sense of it is that UK officialdom has underestimated A, the strength of feeling of the US about this issue, and B, the risk that we are taking with this company. Do you want to sort of elaborate on?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I am one of the. I mean, I'm by and large entirely supportive of the government's agenda, but I do think that one of the decisions they've taken, which is to allow Huawei to have up to 35% of bits of our 5G network, is wrong, and what I and others are arguing for is a practical glide path down to zero for that. But in a way, I'm not. I mean, I'm obviously fully aware of what the Americans are saying about this, and indeed what the Australians and others
and the Japanese
are saying. That the Japanese, Orange in France is building a network without Huawei, so it can practically be done. Others are very worried, but I'm less concerned with the effect on our immediate allies, Syria, than it is straightforwardly about our own long-term security. That if 5G is going to be as all important as we all think it is, that actually many of our basic systems, banking, transport and so on, will depend on this network, then if now we are describing somebody as a high-risk vendor, which is the British government's own description of Huawei, then what on earth are we thinking of? Putting them at the heart of our national infrastructure for the next 30 years. I mean, this seems to me almost a no-brainer that you wouldn't want to do that. And I get all the practical problems that they're already embedded in 4G and so on, and therefore you can't just say go away tomorrow, otherwise our current systems would fall down. But it does seem to me to be strategically a bad decision. And I'm struck by not just the international opposition to it, but also the opposition within the Parliamentary Conservative Party. So I think it will be quite considerable. And one of the points that's often not made strongly enough, which I think is true, is that a lot of our allies think that around the world, smaller countries will look at the UK decision,
follow the lead,
and say, okay, fine, well, if the Brits are fine with it, then we'll be fine with it as well. And so the entire world will be dependent on Chinese technology. And I profoundly wish that China behaved in a way that we could regard them as a normal, indeed hugely successful member of the global economy. But unless and until they behave in a security context, and indeed in a sort of intellectual property context, in a way that makes them a normal global citizen, then they can't be treated like one.